We live in a world our ancestors would barely recognize. Around the globe, the impact of human ingenuity is now everywhere. We've pushed back the limits of our planet at speeds, depths, and heights that would have left our forebears breathless. Driving all these achievements is humankind's extraordinary gift for invention. Through genius and inspiration, we've created exceptional solutions to complex problems. From the everyday to the spectacular, some good and some not so good. This series celebrates the million ways our great inventions have transformed our world.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We love pleasure, we love socializing, and we love opulent celebrations. Think of a great invention that was inspired by nature. We associate it with one-of-a-kind holiday moments and unforgettable dates. Already the Romans were devoted to its cult.
It was an integral part of our historical civilization.
It really tells you a lot about humanity from a lot of different perspectives.
It's an invention for which merchant fleets were built and battles were fought, a symbol of sensuality and joie de vivre.
It's a perfect way to celebrate any occasion.
Many believe it's from Europe, when in fact its origins lie in Asia. Over the course of time, we humans have developed and improved its production. What used to be back-breaking work has become easier thanks to modern technology. Each of us associates a different story with it.
It's an everyday accompaniment for your meal, or it's an investment.
Its production is not always in harmony with nature, but it's hardly conceivable that we'd ever do without it.
It was alcohol, but in a moderate, classy way.
Wine. Year for year, millions of us make a pilgrimage to vineyards located all over the world to taste, rate, and buy wines. Whether mass-produced or of top quality, wine is loved and celebrated all over the world. What's behind our fascination with it?
Wine is the perfect way to celebrate any occasion. If you've been promoted at work, drink some wine. If you've had a long day with the kids and you've survived, have some wine. You're just meeting up with an old friend to catch up. Wine is the perfect thing.
It perhaps makes you more talkative, it breaks down barriers, it loosens the tongue, it perhaps makes you bolder.
Across the world, more beer is consumed than wine, but wine has that certain something.
Wine is the perfect date drink because you have to sip it. You don't glug it like a beer. It's more sophisticated than a mixer and a spirit. And if you run out of conversation, you can always just talk about the wine.
These grapes will make fine wine. The amount produced annually corresponds to 35 billion bottles. Wines are fetching record sums at auctions. The most expensive bottle thus far sold for $230,000.
I think that if I owned a bottle of wine that cost more than my month's rent, I would just be too scared to drink it.
I spent probably about £175 on a bottle of, which is a very nice champagne.
Global hype has erupted around wine. In fact, the city of Bordeaux erected a monument in its honor. La Cité du Vin, a huge museum dedicated to the history of wine. While Europe is the cradle of wine, North America is the biggest market for it, but demand is growing in Asia as well. Wine, a great invention, but where do its origins lie?
I suppose our very, very distant ancestors probably discovered the intoxicating effects of wine from fermenting grapes that they happened to stumble upon, many tens of thousands of years ago.
But they needed to settle down before they could practice labor-intensive viticulture. They also had to take up the challenge of cultivating wild grapes. Only a single grape species, Vitis vinifera, is the common ancestor of all the 8,000 grape varieties grown today. Some 8,000 years ago, it was growers in Georgia who apparently laid down the foundations for today's wine culture. In Egypt, wine was already a cult drink of pharaohs and nobles by 3000 BC. But how could clear must be obtained from grapes? Egyptians relied on manpower. The grapes were crushed by foot in vats. The leftovers were pressed in a linen sack and subsequently filled into clay vessels. These vessels are still made today, like they were in ancient times. They were sealed with mud from the Nile. Fermentation could then begin.
It's turned into something that is a human artifact and is a product of, great sophistication and technological development. So, now it is very much a facet of culture.
Greeks too were obsessed with this intoxicating elixir of life, and their knowledge of wine was inherited by Romans, who turned the city of Pompeii into the center of the wine industry.
And the Romans almost had a cult of wonderful wine and their amazing god Bacchus.
Many cultures associated wine with religious myths and healing powers. It was part of wine's success story. Romans were already pursuing pleasure and excess. The elites drank the best wines from the first pressing. Everyone else had to make do with the second pressing. Soon, Romans were bringing grapevines with them as they made their conquests. Wine-growing traditions throughout much of Europe go back to the Romans. But how were they able to satisfy the enormous demand of settlers and soldiers? The Roman wine press house from the 3rd century AD bears witness to the inventive spirit of the Romans. They crushed the grapes and transferred the mash, the juice and fruit mixture, to a basket press. An ingenious innovation was then deployed, the wooden beam press, which used a log to press the grape-filled basket. Not all the wines that were produced by Romans would have pleased our palates.
In the ancient world, people didn't drink wines for their own inherent flavours. People drank wines because those wines were mixed with things like myrrh or exotic spices, cinnamon, as well as a whole range of probably less palatable ingredients, which we would find very difficult to stomach today, I think.
Our taste in wines has changed over the course of time. Which ideas and innovations influenced our preferences? One thing remained unchanged for a long time: harvesting by hand. From antiquity to the mid-20th century, this was standard practice. In a first step to ease the physical burden, the grapes were ground right at the vineyard. The resulting mash could more easily be transported by oxen or horse cart to the press. It was back-breaking work nonetheless. Progress also came in the form of a simple rail system. The big breakthrough, however, came with mechanical harvesters that were introduced in the 1960s. A harvester shakes the vines, causing the grapes to fall onto a conveyor belt. This machine can harvest 1 hectare every 3 hours, whereas 30 people would need all day to complete the work. Mechanical harvesters are used for large-scale operations by most wine growers today. Grapes from the top vineyards are picked by hand.
So to be a successful wine grower, you need 3 things. You need science, you need nature, and you need human nature. You need to be able to harness all those things if you want to turn a profit.
Italy is not only a successful wine producer, it's also the world's biggest. Its soils and climate create the perfect conditions for world-renowned wines. In Bulgaria, a region in Tuscany, harvesting is done by hand, as this guarantees highest quality. Only ripe, healthy grapes are selected. All others are rejected. Human labor costs money, and this, of course, makes these wines more expensive. What is of utmost importance is that the grapes are handled with care.
They must never be thrown, as this causes grape berries to become detached from the stems. It's crucial that the grape bunches reach the cellar intact.
If the grape skins rupture, the fermentation process sets in too early, and this may impact the taste. The grape harvest is a race against time in every country. The work of an entire year can be lost if it rains. Machine harvesting is a blessing where quick harvesting is paramount. For the time being, however, human laborers still hold the comparative advantage.
Harvesters have evolved into amazing machines with state-of-the-art technology, but they can't distinguish between good and bad grapes. That's still a way off, but the problem is being worked on. At the moment, hand harvesting still yields better results.
After the harvest, it's time for the pressing. Finding the perfect techniques is something that vintners have been tinkering with for ages. Indeed, gentle pressing is decisive for the taste. Overpressing will extract bitter seed tannins and parts of the stem. A groundbreaking innovation was introduced in the 1950s, the pneumatic wine press. A so-called bladder in the tank presses the mash against the tank wall. Its large press area ensures that the grape berries are very gently pressed. Nowadays, fully automated membrane presses are used. Innovative techniques have revolutionized winemaking.
Cutting-edge pressing technology can almost read my mind, or I program it with my thoughts. Do I want to press quickly? Do I want to press slowly? Do I have hard grapes or squishy overripe ones? I want excellent quality, so I press slowly and with care, turning left or right. It's almost a philosophy. In the past, one would have said, you start now and then you stop at one point. But this can think for itself. I don't want to call it artificial intelligence, but this is very advanced cellar technology.
Great technical inventions have optimized wine production. But how could it be avoided that all the work was in vain in the end?
It wasn't really until the beginning of the 20th century did we fully understand what was actually going on in the fermentation process.
It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Louis Pasteur, the scientist, demystified the secret of alcoholic fermentation. While conducting experiments, he discovered that yeasts convert sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide.
Louis Pasteur's work was groundbreaking for winemakers.
Yeast occurs naturally on the skin of grapes. The riper they are, the higher their sugar content. If the grape berries rupture, spontaneous fermentation sets in and alcohol is produced. The problem is that
some of those natural yeasts were sensitive to alcohol. So when the fermentation reached 3 or 4% alcohol, it stopped.
for the longest time, the creation of palatable wines depended on the changing mood of the yeast. Alternatives had to be sought. In 1894, one of the first yeast breeding centers was founded at today's Geisenheim University in Germany. Yeasts that occur naturally in nature are still being researched here today. The goal is to breed yeasts that behave the way the vintner wants. They should be fit enough to make 14 to 16% alcohol by volume, and they should also impact the wine's taste.
Yeasts can influence the taste because the grapes per se only contain aroma compound precursors. These are bound to the sugar, and yeast splits off this sugar and releases aromatic substances. During fermentation, yeast produces new aromatic substances. In other words, it's possible to determine which yeasts produce which flavorings, and one can thus recommend specific yeasts for specific wines and wine types.
In the meantime, almost all vintners use lab-grown yeasts, like at the Kloster Eberbach winery. Wine has been cultivated here for over 800 years. Old barrels once used by monks for winemaking are still being stored here in the so-called Kabinett-Keller.
The fact that wine was produced as well as it was 500 years ago was due to one main fact, which was the Christianization of the West.
Wherever there were Christians, there was also a demand for altar wine for religious rites. And this was supplied by the monks, whose winemaking traditions reached back for centuries. Nevertheless, sometimes the wine had spoiled because cultured yeasts were as yet unknown. Or did the headache have another cause? Today, the cellar of this wine estate is one of Europe's most modern. White Riesling is produced here. After pressing, grape skin and pulp rests can be seen floating in the must. This is where filtration comes in. Then the yeast is added. As the sugar is converted into alcohol, heat is generated. A solution had to be found to cool the must and thereby prevent an all too stormy fermentation process.
Climate control in winemaking has always been a challenge. Especially in hot climates, it's always been difficult to keep the wine cool enough to ferment properly.
These stainless steel wine tanks with built-in cooling coils marked a milestone in winemaking. The generated heat is optimally dissipated thanks to the large surface area. They've been in use all over the world since the 1980s. In making balanced, high-quality wines, it's important to control the temperature, otherwise the aromas can't develop properly. Generally, fermentation takes between 3 days and 3 weeks, depending on what style of wine is desired.
Temperature can be used to determine the fermentation duration. By drastically lowering the temperature, the fermentation process can even be stopped. Low temperature causes the yeasts to become inactive. Alcoholic fermentation stops leaving residual sugar and a sweeter wine.
There are many different wines, so which one do we prefer? When it comes to white wine, we like Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay and Heirenne. Our favorite reds are Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot and Tempranillo. The famous Spanish red wine Rioja is made from Tempranillo. To make red wine, the grapes are not pressed immediately, but only squeezed a little. Because they had discovered the red color is only in the grape skin. This is also where the tannins which affect the wine's flavor profile are. So fermentation must take place in the mash. It allows pigments from the grape skins to be slowly released into the must. The so-called cap, consisting of skins, seeds and stems, protects the wine from oxygen. The vintner keeps pushing it down so it mixes with the juices. If one were to press the red grapes directly, the result would be white wine. For thousands of years, winemakers all over the world experimented to create the best wines. In earlier times, however, the lack of infrastructure presented them with a big problem. How was wine able to conquer the world before the advent of trains or airplanes?
The success of a wine isn't just about how it tastes. It's about finding a market for that particular wine. It's about finding efficient trade routes to get it to the people who want to buy it. And it's about overcoming customs barriers and anything else that will stop your product reaching its buyers.
The Wine Museum in Bordeaux deals with wine's sensationally early trading history. For centuries, the Rhine River was Western Europe's main artery for wine trade. Since ancient times, it was used by merchants to transport goods from the Alps to the North Sea. Englishmen already began trading wines from the Bordeaux region in the 12th century. This is what established the legendary reputation of French wines. The thirst of the English was of incredible significance for the course of world history.
The English loved French wine, especially from the Bordeaux region, but they had the challenge of getting it from mainland Europe to the island of Britain. And they did that by developing their merchant fleets. And some historians assume that that is what gave them an advantage at the beginning of those international trade wars. They already had the fleet, and that led to England's dominance over trade throughout the world.
Soon, merchants were even trading in overseas markets. Wine became an important economic commodity throughout Europe. But this went hand in hand with risk.
It's actually believed that in Italy in the 19th century, the majority of people made their living from wine. And that was largely true in Spain and France as well. But it was pretty dangerous to have such a large proportion of your economy dependent on something that's sort of vulnerable to the laws of and volatilities of nature.
The catastrophe was not long in coming. Vines were imported from America to Europe, and traveling with them was a tiny little animal, the grapevine louse, or grape phylloxera. The most dangerous of all vine pests drove European viticulture to the brink of ruin. The phylloxera destroys the roots of vines and devastates entire regions. At the end of the 19th century, almost 80% of all vineyards on the old continent had been destroyed.
It was a real disaster for many people across Europe who really were relying on wine to make a living. And it really took a lot of hard work on behalf of specialists in order to cultivate wine which had protection against this disease.
It took a lot of experimentation for scientists to discover that some American vines are resistant to phylloxera. So they took these rootstocks and grafted the European grape varieties onto them. Viticulture was thus saved. Since then, vines are grafted onto American rootstocks in most countries. The biggest catastrophe in the history of wine laid the foundation for modern viticulture. Vineyards were newly conceived while taking climate, soil, and grape varieties into account. Since then, the Bordeaux wine region is the world's biggest contiguous wine-producing area for quality wines. Its temperate climate is ideal for grapes. Premier Grand Cru Classé wines are produced at Château Angelus. While all countries have different designations for their best products, they have one thing in common. The quality and character of the grapes mirrors the physical environment, or terroir, in which they grow.
The terroir is really the essence for the production of the wine. It's the basic. So it's when you talk about terroir, it's part of the soil, of course, of the climate, of the slope, of the human impact, and everything that is part that constitutes the terroir is going to make the difference on the type of wine that we're going to have. So it's the condition really to make a great wine.
Above all, it's the soil that makes the difference. Merlot grapes grow here. They thrive especially good on limestone. Other grapes need clay or slate soils. But not all sites are equally good. In fact, only a small part of a vineyard will produce the best grapes. It takes vintners decades to figure out exactly where these parcels are located. Wine is a great invention that requires patience and a bit of magic. The vintner's art is the art of blending. Many wines across the world consist of several varieties. In addition to Merlot, here it is the Cabernet Franc grape. How do you achieve the right blend that reflects the brand? The taste changes even if just a small part of the vintage is sourced from a parcel with a poorer soil type. Everything is tasted to determine the perfect blend. For hundreds of years, it has been European vintners who set the tone. But for how long will they be able to defend their traditional dominance vis-à-vis the rest of the world? A legendary event in Paris sparked discussions around the world.
For a long time, the European countries of France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Germany have been the cradle of wine. That's where it was really developed. And France especially was seen as the god of wine. But in 1976, that all changed, and the wine world order was completely shaken up.
France's foremost wine critics and experts gathered in Paris to blind taste wines. White and red wines from France were compared with wines from California's Napa Valley.
The French winemakers thought this would be an easy win, but when the results were returned, it was American wines that hit the top of the red and the white charts. It was a huge embarrassment for France.
The event clearly showed that top-quality wines were being produced in the New World. In the mid-19th century, it was two immigrants, German-born Charles Krug and Hungarian Ágoston Horoszty, who pioneered viticulture in America. Horoszty brought 160 grape varieties from Europe to North America and established a flourishing business, the Buena Vista Winery. It still exists today. At the beginning of the 20th century, Californian viticulture experienced an unexpected heyday. The phylloxera catastrophe had almost completely wiped out the competition from Europe. But then the tide turned. Alcohol consumption was increasingly demonized, and the start of the Prohibition era brought the wine boom to an abrupt end.
So the ban on alcohol, I think, was largely related to the Bible Belt states and the increasing sense of immorality associated with the consumption of wine. And a lot of that was really how wine was being misused across in the Old World in Europe.
The abuse of alcohol was one reason. What weighed more heavily, however, was public morality. Excessive partying, sexual promiscuity, and the birth of the swing era were a thorn in the side of many.
And so the prohibition of wine was really tied up with a very Christian sense of morality.
In 1920, the sale of alcohol was banned in the United States. All breweries, wineries, and distilleries were shut down. Alcohol consumption dipped slightly, but the shadow economy flourished. Since necessity is the mother of invention, it wasn't long before entrepreneurs came up with an idea. They had grapes pressed into brick-shaped blocks which were sold in supermarkets with advice on how to prevent the product's fermentation, which would turn juice into wine.
One negative effect of a prohibition was the creation of a kind of criminal underworld, particularly that led by Al Capone, where you'd have hidden drinking dens, where in fact arguably the same excessive consumption of alcohol was going on, but not in public space.
Trade with illegal alcohol turned corruption and lawlessness into a mass phenomenon. Gang wars shook Chicago and New York. Instead of wine and beer, brandy was illegally distilled. The police were unable to get a handle on this surge in crime. In 1933, the prohibition was lifted. The party could now resume. Between 1920 and 1933, wine production had come to a complete standstill. When it was finally relaunched, Americans put their emphasis on mass production. The mega vineyards could no longer be worked by oxen or horses alone. Mechanization brought groundbreaking transformation. In the New World, the opportunities that went hand in hand with this were quickly seized upon. Machines and tractors quickly conquered the vineyards. This posed a bit of a problem for many European vintners.
In the mid-1950s, the average size of a European vineyard was less than 10 hectares. But as mechanization came along, these small vineyards found it difficult to survive. In Australia and America, large corporations took over huge areas of cultivation. Industrial winemaking was booming.
This period marked the advent of such huge American wineries as the Bronco Wine Company and the Gallo Winery. In the 60s, they popularized inexpensive table wines labeled Chablis or Hearty Burgundy. Beer got serious competition. But small, exclusive American wineries also began to capture the fancy of wine aficionados.
As always, though, there is a counter-movement to mass production. And even in the New World, small vineyards are there to create unique and fascinating wines.
In the meantime, wine has become popular on many continents. Australia's wine industry is booming, and Argentina is South America's most important wine producer. While the biggest wine producers are still located in Europe, major wine-growing regions can also be found in the US, South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, China, and Russia. Viticulture is largely concentrated in the world's more temperate climate zones. While there are great wineries in the New World, French wines are still frequently the benchmark for fine wine enthusiasts. So how can winemakers get that taste of France into their wines? The secret is in French oak barrels. Once fermentation is finished, high-quality wines are often transferred to so-called barrique barrels to age. French wine growers prefer locally sourced oak barrels. These barrels are used all over the world.
The wood is very important for the aging of our wines. It's interesting because, of course, the wood will bring tannins to the wine that already has tannins. So we have this exchange between the two that is really interesting. And this aging will last for about 22, 24 months.
Making high-quality wine barrels takes an elaborate process. Only few people, known as coopers, still master this craft. After constructing the barrel, the cooper burns wood chips inside it. This so-called toasting extracts various flavors from the oak.
We can really make the difference when we taste of the different coopers, depending on the heat. The heat can influence the toastiness and the flavor in the end. If you have a hot heating, then it could give a vanilla aroma to the wine. So that's very important that the wood doesn't overtake the taste of the wine.
Every trend has a counter-trend. As it happens, wine producers all over the world are currently returning their focus to own regional characteristics. Meanwhile, vintners also use old barrels to slightly soften the oak taste. Up until the 17th century, all wines were stored in barrels until they were ready to drink. This made storage and transport cumbersome. A great invention was able to remedy this problem. Even in ancient times, wine had to be stored, transported and sold. Mainly clay vessels were used for this purpose. The complex nature of glassblowing kept the number of glass containers produced very low. This is the world's oldest wine bottle, some 1700 years old. It was found in a Roman grave. By the end of the Middle Ages, bottles were already being used fairly often, but only to serve wine at the table. In England's glassworks, bulbous vessels for transportation were being produced in larger numbers around the mid-17th century. Cereal production had not yet begun. 1903 saw a sensational breakthrough when Michael Owens developed a fully automated machine to produce hollow glass. Production was industrialized. Bottles and jars are ingenious packaging. They are transparent, easy to clean, and hygienic.
The use of glass bottles with labels enabled people to market it, to develop a particular name, a brand, and to advertise various properties and qualities on that wine.
These bottles represented another milestone in wine production. Hundreds of bottles from the 18th and 19th centuries are still being stored in the treasure chamber of the Kloster Eberbach winery in Germany.
Once it became possible to bottle wine, it also became easier to trade. Previously, wine could only be sold by the barrel. And who wants to store a barrel in their home? This was an option only for innkeepers or nobles whose wine consumption justified it and whose deep pockets allowed it. Selling wine by the bottle democratized wine consumption.
Wine bottles are optimally stored at a cellar temperature of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius. From the 17th century onward, the bottles were sealed with cork. Prior to this, leather or glass stoppers were used. But how was it possible to get the cork back out of the bottle? The corkscrew had to be invented for this purpose. And how long does wine keep in a bottle?
There's no real expiration date for wines. We have wines that go back to the 18th century. They are, however, more reminiscent of sherry. With some of the dry Rieslings from the mid-19th century, however, you'd never believe that they were 160, 170, or even 180 years old.
For the longest time, bottling and labeling was done by hand. And winemakers always sold their products with cork stoppers. Cork doesn't create a completely airtight seal. The wine oxidizes very slowly and continues to age. With red wines, this is often desired. The disadvantage of using cork is that wine sometimes takes on a corky taste. For more and more winemakers, screw caps are the solution of choice. They are especially popular for white wines because they provide an airtight seal that preserves its fresh character. The world's most exclusive drink would never have come into existence without the invention of the bottle. Champagne, a symbol for luxury and joie de vivre. Whenever there's something to celebrate, nothing does the job quite like champagne.
What's fascinating about champagne is that it was created as a result of the winemaking process going wrong. In the 17th century, the Champagne region of France was producing wine, but suffered from very cold winters. So in the autumn, the fermentation process would stop, only to start again the following spring, producing what they thought was a very fizzy mistake. The wine-obsessed English would import these barrels from Champagne, and the second fermentation would start on the crossing. So when they opened up the barrels, they discovered this incredible sparkling wine. And instead of thinking it was a mistake, they thought it was wonderful.
Champagne soon conquered all of Europe. The nobility had already fallen into the habit of drinking Ruinart, Veuve Clicquot, or Moët Chandon with their breakfast of oysters. Napoleon's visit to Moët Chandon in 1807 was legendary. It caused demand to soar. With some 30 million bottles sold every year, this champagne house is today's market leader. Back in the early days, champagne makers didn't have the fermentation process under control, which is why 80% of the bottles exploded. The solution? After the first round of fermentation, the exact right mix of cane sugar and yeast is added to the base wine. This so-called liqueur de tirage then triggers secondary fermentation in the bottle. Another milestone was the invention of the riddling rack in 1815. Turned by hand 1/8 of a circle every day, the bottles are fermented on this rack for up to 3 months. The downward tilt causes the yeast to gather in the bottleneck. In large companies, computer-controlled systems usually perform this task. When the yeast sediment is finally disgorged, the lost volume is refilled and the bottle is recorked. Only sparkling wines from the French Champagne region may call themselves champagne. In other countries, such wines are called spumante or cava.
The invention of champagne came at exactly the right time. Wine growers who thought that their product had been wasted had found a new market for their new product. It just shows that the history of wine is never just caught up in the production, it's also caught up in culture and social history.
Today, wine drinking is usually associated with conviviality and enjoyment. Of course, sometimes we get carried away. But is it conceivable to us that wine had an entirely different function throughout the Middle Ages and up to the 17th century?
Wine was accessible to everybody, affordable by everybody. It was used as a means of trade and pay. Shipyard workers in Venice received 2 litres of wine diluted in water for every day of work they did.
Wine, along with thin beer, was the only halfway healthy and palatable thing to drink. Men, women and children consumed it in large quantities because the town wells were dirty. Clean drinking water was not available. Alcohol is a disinfectant, and thus it was already consumed in the morning.
I suppose until we could guarantee that we had sterile water, wine is one of the only liquids that's not going to contain really damaging bacteria. So there is a sort of scientific, sort of pathogenic reason for wine consumption. And everybody must have walked around in a complete buzz pretty much all the time.
Other luxury foods were rare as well. It wasn't until the 17th century that chocolate from Central America, coffee from the Near East and brandy from Holland became all the rage. So when competing goods became available, wine growers were forced to improve the quality of their wines. In the 20th century, every country was producing renowned quality wines. A market for the most sought-after and collectible wines emerged. It was the French who fought the bravest battle for wine.
I think wine is certainly a part of the national identity for many of the big wine-producing countries like France and Spain and Italy. I mean, there's certainly been many political battles and arguably wars waged over it.
When the Germans occupied France during World War II, courageous Frenchmen risked their lives to protect this valuable commodity from the Nazis.
And so we know that French railway men filled wagons with wine in order to take them away and hide them.
The German occupiers had been ordered by Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering to bring the most precious wines and champagnes to Germany.
So when Hermann Goering demanded some highly prized wine, some different liquid was pumped into the bottles of wine that he wanted. And French wine restaurant called La Tour d'Argent immured the bottles of its most precious wine, so hid them behind walls in order to protect them from the Germans.
After their country was liberated by the Allies, the French celebrated and counted the wine stocks. Despite fierce resistance, some 320 million bottles of wine had been looted by German soldiers every year. The stocks were replenished over the following decades, but there was a change in wine consumption. In 1920, the French still drank an average of 153 litres per head each year. This amount has dropped to 50 litres today. Elsewhere, wine consumption has also declined.
The wine market is changing all the time. In Europe, people are drinking less wine than they used to, but new wine markets are opening up now all over the world.
The Chinese have discovered wine. And since Bordeaux wines enjoy such a legendary reputation, a lot of money from China is flowing into this area. Wealthy Chinese have cast a covetous eye on French wineries. Li Liluan, a broker, has already sold some 120 chateaux to Chinese millionaires. Some of them have even replicated French wine estates in the Middle Kingdom.
The Chinese, they invest the vineyards because the wine is a business, also it's a lifestyle. So they buy the vineyards, also they can do the wine business. They can share with friends, but also they can have the good investment.
The new owners are working together with French vintners and cellar masters to learn the finer points of winemaking. The Chinese are getting authentic experience here, and they are also growing wine, increasingly successfully, in their own country. In the meantime, China has become the world's 10th biggest wine producer.
There is a huge hype about wine, and it is only growing. One thing guaranteed to make people interested in wine is when celebrities get interested in wine. Back in the 70s, director Francis Coppola bought his vineyard, one of the first celebrity vineyard owners.
Many others followed the example of cult director Francis Ford Coppola. All over the world, celebrities have been buying vineyards and creating their own brands. But with all the hype, a big challenge is often suppressed. The dark side of wine growing is the chemical pesticides that are dispersed on wine grapes. The post-World War II era saw enormous yields, increases made possible by the extensive use of pesticides. In the meantime, wine growers are engaged in a process of rethinking.
This is not only raising concerns amongst scientists, it's also amongst us consumers as well. It's definitely a challenge for producers to not sort of just fall prey to market pressures, and that we find a way to make wine growing more sustainable.
Grapes are extremely susceptible to fungi and pests of all kinds. In particular, real and false mildew threaten the vines. Scientists around the world are trying to figure out how to fight it. Another threat comes from animal species with an appetite for grapevines. Caterpillars of the dreaded grape moth relentlessly devour blossoms, fruit and leaves. Alternatives to pesticides are constantly being sought. More and more vintners are transitioning from conventional to organic wine growing. The battle against pests is being fought with copper, sulfur and even baking powder. Instead of mineral fertilizers, humus is being used to enrich soil. Clover and vetch are being planted among the vines to enhance biodiversity. Healthy soils help ward off diseases in the vineyards.
I am against chemical weed control and I don't want to use mineral fertilizer. My cultivation methods are geared toward biodiversity conservation. And if I can produce good wine at the same time, my mission is accomplished.
Embarking on new paths entails experimenting with natural wines. Contemporary vintners are turning to old methods. Sometimes they don't even add cultured yeast. Reconciling environmental protection and wine growing is an important task for the future. It could play a role in dealing with the greatest challenge of our time.
Everywhere in the world, wine of every style is being produced, so the future of wine does look bright. But climate change will have an effect.
Climate change is having a real impact. Grapevines are now thriving in cooler regions. Drought conditions could, however, endanger wine growing in southern Europe, California and Australia. And water shortages could also precipitate distribution problems.
And there's also the issue of competing interests for water resources, including agricultural and domestic needs. All these topics will take on greater urgency over the coming 20 to 50 years.
Will we be able to adopt countermeasures in time? Scientists at Geisenheim University are focusing on digital technology-assisted viticulture. These drones come equipped with sensors and cameras. They photograph the condition of the leaves and grape berries. A software evaluates the images and can recognize the lack of nutrients or water. For the naked eye, this will be difficult to detect. Moreover, grapevines are often located on steep slopes that are difficult to access. An additional drone will be deployed in the future. The multicopter could supply the vines with targeted doses of nutrients and water. Will this help?
Winemakers have always had to deal with natural disasters, from volcanic eruptions to floods or freezing winters, and they've always made it through.
Wine is a global success story. From table wines to the luxury wines that have become a status symbol for the wealthy, wine is enjoyed all over the world. It is part and parcel of any festive event or unforgettable date.
It was alcohol, but in a moderate, classy way. Wine is sort of seen as an accompaniment to the food that you're having or the conversation.
Each bottle captures the history and culture of its country of origin.
Wine is so fascinating to people, I think in part because it's been embedded in lots of different cultures and societies and rituals and habits.
In Europe, passionate and creative vintners with a pioneering spirit laid down the foundation for today's modern wine industry. and scientists unraveled the secret of fermentation. The setbacks that winemakers suffered in the New World were not able to derail their momentum.
Despite Europe's reputation as being the best of the best, really good wines are being made all over the world.
It's a gift from nature, and while the taste of wine has changed through the ages, it will continue to be an integral part of our culture and history for a long time to come.